Okay, so I want to officially say hello to everyone and welcome you to our webinar. The topic is the third Mussar topic, compassion and rachamim. I'm going to look at our agenda. So I'm going to start the way I always start, which is talking about our team Facebook group. I want to remind you to share the interesting things your students are doing. And I also want to point out a couple of great stuff that came in last time. Rabbi Janice Merrin posted a link to the 10 daily practices to strengthen our character in the 21st century. That kind of expands on what we were doing in our first webinar. And it's really useful, so I want to thank Janice. I hear feedback. If anybody wants to mute themselves when they're not talking, that might be helpful, because I keep hearing a feedback. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. Another great thing, Ellen, who's here, also spoke about, and she put up some things that her students are doing. So we had this discussion at the end of the last webinar, and it was really great, and she kind of ran with it and did some great stuff for the students. You can check that out on Facebook too. And then also Rabbi David Steinberg sent his lesson plan that he did with his confirmation class. It was really interesting to see what he did, how he expanded on what we were doing, and how it went. He also showed how much they got to during it, which was really good. So that's really exciting. And I also want to thank the people who sent photos, like Ellen and some others, that I could use in our ad journal for our gala. The Chai Mitzvah Gala is going to be on November 9th, and this is how we raise money so that we can give you guys stipends and we can provide our materials at no cost. So it's really, really helpful. I really appreciate the great inspirational photos that people sent. They're like just really wonderful. So thank you. So let's get started with our themes. Today we're going to focus on the Chai Mitzvah Team Mussar topic, compassion, rachamim. It corresponds to the November Chai Mitzvah topic, individual community. So we'll see how compassion plays out in our relationships with others and in the community. So let's look at the themes. The interconnectedness of self and other, and the responsibility to care for the larger community are two things that we're going to be focusing on. So let's take a look at the text and see how this works. Okay, so there are two texts that we see here. One's from Deuteronomy, one's from Exodus. And as you know, very often Jewish texts remind us about our experience in Egypt. And to this day, that experience of our ancestors as slaves plays a really large role in our attitude of compassion. So we can read the two texts. You shall love the stranger because you have been strangers in the land of Egypt. And you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or orphan. Okay, so we can look at these two and they're related. And so we can look at the relationship between our experience as strangers in Egypt and each of the commandments. And then we can also talk about how this applies to things teenagers are going through. The photo here I used especially because a lot of times teenagers feel like strangers, whether they're included or not included in a group. So you can encourage your students to share feelings about their experiences. Is it hard to be kind and to include someone when others don't want that person to be included? What are some good ways to handle these delicate experiences where you're put in this kind of situation? And so that's one of the things that we can pick up from these texts. Also, there's a midah other than compassion at play in these verses. Suggest that the students check out their midah cards and help them consider what other midot might be discussed here. Look at the wording to love compared to not to wrong in the Exodus passage, in the Deuteronomy passage to love. So what is that? What are we getting at here? What's the difference between to love and to not wrong? Anybody want to jump in? Okay, so I'll tell you how I read it. To love is more compassion. To not wrong is more justice. So we can start comparing justice and compassion. And one of the things in these supplements, tradition suggests that the world can't survive on justice alone. On supplement page A, there's a midrash in which God sought to create the world through the quality of justice, or realized that justice had to be balanced with compassion so the world could endure. So I'm going to read this midrash real quickly, because I don't know if you can see it on the screen. My screen's big and I still can't see.
Nina, are we allowed to ask questions?
Please ask questions. Jump in anytime. That's why you're here. Yes, please.
Okay. So I had materials because I'm teaching this Sunday.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, really?
Now I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you just have, yeah. Wait, look at the way you spoke a minute ago was perfect. If you could ask your question just that way.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the way it's framed is having the world exist with justice and not compassion.
Wait, you know what I'm thinking? Because it's a little hard to hear. Can you maybe put it in the chat window? Because I'm having trouble hearing you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Nina, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Yeah.
Okay. I'll throw a question in.
Great.
When we put out texts about you were strangers to the land of Egypt, I find, I don't know if it's a question or statement, that if we teach our students that Egypt is not some place in distant history, but is any restricted place they live in at any point right now in their lives, suddenly it becomes more real to them.
Absolutely.
And they can handle symbolic, like God, 10-year-olds understand the symbol of Egypt. But I think it's really important if we're going to do that, not to leave it floating out there like it's something that happened thousands of years ago, but to give them that contemporary view of any Mitzrayim.
Completely right. When I first started teaching 100 years ago, there was one kid I had in my 5th grade class who just was not fitting in. He was new and he stuttered, and it was not an easy thing for him. And I remember that the rabbi who was the principal of my school, I was 20, came in and talked to them about being strangers in the land of Egypt. And ever since then, I've realized how that is such a metaphor exactly for what we're talking about. So it's very important, you're right, to point out that it's a metaphor. It's not just something that happened a million years ago. And it's relevant to all of us. I'm looking to, Hannah, did you type your question? Because I don't see it. Maybe it's in the Q&A. I'm going to look for it there. No, I don't see it there either. I'd really like to answer your question, but let's try one more time to speak. Hannah. Wait.
Yeah, I don't know how to type a question.
Oh, now you're fine. Now I can hear you. What was your question?
You know what? I'm going to wait and ask the question after you read the
the other story?
Because I have questions related to
that. Okay. If nobody has anything to add right now, I will read this story about justice and compassion. It's interesting to think about what justice is and what compassion is. And after we read the story, some ideas I had about it. We can talk about your ideas. So the Torah says that in the day that Hashem Elohim made the earth and the heavens, why does creation begin with the divine name Elohim, like Bereshit bara Elohim and Hashemayim v'et haaretz, as the creator, and then with 2 names? I say Hashem Elohim. It's the name. The Midrash explains, this may be compared to a king who had some empty glasses that he wished to fill with water. The king thought, if I pour hot water into them, they will burst. However, if I pour cold water, they will shatter. What did the king do? He poured in a mixture of hot and cold water so the glasses would remain whole. So said the Holy One, if I create the world on the basis of compassion alone, its sins will be oppressive. On the basis of judgment alone, how would the world be able to exist? I will create it with justice and compassion together, and then maybe it will be able to stand. That's why the name Hashem is added to the name Elohim. Okay, so the reason I think this story is really good is because when you think about justice and compassion, to me it's not immediately clear until you give it some thought what each is and the difference between them. And I really like the hot water, cold water analogy, because if you just think about which one would be the hot water and which one would be the cold water, it's interesting. It helps you to think more about what justice is missing and what compassion is missing. And also, if you think about the whole idea of a midah being a measurement, and we're trying to find the right amount of compassion. We don't want to be so compassionate that everybody walks all over us and we suffer. We don't want to be so lacking in compassion that we're just not nice. We want to be compassionate appropriately. And so the idea of mixing compassion and justice is a very nice one for this also, I think. I would love anybody who wants to comment to jump in here.
You're raising the whole conflict between Din and Rachamim, and part of what that leads to, if you look at any of the mystical sources, is that too much Din is the source of all evil in the world, potentially. So that part, and I don't know how we get to this with our students, but that we think of justice as a really positive thing, but strict justice is when it's taken so far, it flips into just us very quickly. It flips.
Nice. Yes.
It flips into creating such strict rules, the 3 strikes you're out kind of rules that end up causing a lot of cruelty to people and effectively unfairness in the name of fairness. But that's a real complex subject.
Yeah, I love that. That is something that I think teenagers could certainly sink their teeth into. And I think it's a really important discussion. So,
how we teach a little more about not being too compassionate, too loving, too forgiving, all of that side of it, because I think that's in a world where, especially the students I have who are living in a very Christian world, are constantly hearing about how their guys are all loving and caring, and we're all about laws and justice. And how do we show them both, one, that we are very compassionate, and 2, that there is a danger of being too loving and too compassionate and too forgiving.
That's absolutely right. It's very challenging to do, and it's very important. And I think if you look at people realistically, they'll be compassionate as long as they can be. But at some point, everybody has to save themselves at a certain point. You can't just give it. So that's really, really important. Compassion is a very, very important midah, and it has to be appropriate. So you're completely right. I'm going to take a minute.
I have a couple of comments. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. No, I can. Yes.
So one thought that I had about the 2 first texts was, rather than start off by saying that the midah for this month is compassion, but would be to show them the 2 texts and ask them what they think the month's theme is. And my guess would be I haven't taught it yet, but my guess would be that they would probably say justice based on those 2 texts.
Interesting.
And so I was, and so I think my question about this, Genesis Rabbah text is that it's the question is framed in terms of how. Can you hear me?
You just kind of beeped out.
Ugh. Darn.
Yeah. So your question is, yes?
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah. I'm also aiding some other people. Hi, Ruth.
That in the text, the question asked after the text is why can the world not survive on just justice? It feels like it's more focused on the justice part of it, and yet the midah is supposed to be
compassion. Well, that's really good, because I think justice and compassion can very often be confused, and I think that's part of what we have to talk about here, because kind of being compassionate is being just in a certain way, because it's right to have compassion. So it's a really interesting comparison, and I think it's a really important conversation to have. What is justice and what is compassion? What's the difference between the 2 midot? I also see that there's a comment here from Judy. I think about the political commentary about justice having people of different heights all on the same level, and another panel on different size pedestals that makes everyone the same height. Oh, that's really beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, that, do you want to elaborate on that? I'm going to unmute you because I think that's really amazing. Judy? Oh, well, she's not answering. So I think it is, or maybe she doesn't have a microphone. But yeah, that's a really interesting discussion to have also. And it relates so much to what we are doing nowadays. We have a lot of things legislated that used to be just considered fair or compassionate. And it's very interesting to see in our current political climate what how that falls. So that's a very political discussion to have with your teenagers as well. So I would be, oh, no, Mike. Do you want to type anything else about this? It's so interesting. It's really great. I'm really glad that you shared this. I think it's important to remember that because it brings what we're talking about, compassion and justice, into a whole nother light, like being legislated. You know, justice doesn't mean equal. It means giving everyone the opportunity they need or deserve, which reminds me, did anybody look at that amazing video that was shared on our Facebook page about the race where these college students are on a line and their coach says, okay, everyone who has 2 parents, take a step forward. It's unbelievable, and it relates very much to this. Justice doesn't mean equal, it means giving everyone the opportunity they need or deserve. So I would suggest showing that video and having this discussion. And I'll put a link to it just in case. I think I might have put it in last month, but just in case I'll put it again because it's really applies to this and it's really important. Points up that all can't be done by justice alone. Compassion is needed with it. Yes, that video is about privilege. It is about privilege, but one thing the coach says at the end that I love, he says, we all have to run the race. You just have to be aware if you have privilege. And I think sometimes we think that you don't have to run the race if you don't have privilege, and that's not really true. We still all have to run the race. It's just that we have to be aware that some people may not have the same privilege as others. So I think that's important.
Is there going to be a separate one on justice? I haven't looked at all of them, but
no,
because I still, even in this conversation, I still feel like we're mostly talking about justice, and I'm losing the compassion part of it.
Well, let's go ahead and see if we find some more compassion, because we should be discussing compassion. And I think that they're very closely related, and I think that's very important what you brought up. So, let's go and talk about what comes next, because it turns more into compassion. Okay, so, oh wait, another thing I was going to say about what we just stopped though, a debate between justice and compassion. One of the things suggested in the materials is have Jonah debate Ruth. Jonah only wanted justice. He was really upset that God forgave the people of Nineveh, whereas Ruth was like all about compassion. But I think even for teenagers, if we can think of, and I could not think of one, but hopefully you can, a video or people who are right now known in the current climate, if there's anyone who could have this discussion, who could compare justice, have a debate between justice and compassion, I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. It's one of the suggested activities, and I think, contrasting two people debating this could be very interesting. All right, so this from Pirkei Avot, this text I think is going to give us a lot more of a highlight on compassion. One's compassion should extend to all creatures, and one should neither despise nor destroy them. For the wisdom above extends to all of creation, inanimate objects, plants, animals, and humans. So here, I think it's a little bit different because we don't have the same kind of justice. We don't have, or we didn't have laws protecting animals for a long time. This law is from the 16th century, this text, I mean. And it extends our sphere of compassion from humans to animals to inanimate objects. And so there's interesting implications of not privileging compassion towards only human beings. So one of the things I thought about when I read this is that you become a compassionate person if you care about your pen, which I know sounds crazy, but if you're that kind of person who can think about compassion towards all kinds of things, then you are actually a compassionate person. You're not just acting with compassion in certain situations. And when compassion it affects every action, it makes us more quickly respond compassionately to things. So we'll respect our environment, we'll respect our relationships with other people, we'll respect the community, and we'll think about that automatically. And that makes us a compassionate person, not just someone who's doing a compassionate act. I would love any comments if you want to jump in. I'll tell you something else I was thinking about. So back in the very early 80s, I worked for Melton with Barry Holt and Eddie Rauch. They used to do children's materials as well as the adult stuff they do now. And we did a book on Rambam, and Eddie wrote something that I never forgot. He said, because we were like comparing 3 ways of looking at a dog. You can look at them as their physical characteristics, you can look at them as like emotionally, as a pet. And he said that things that seemed fine 50 years ago might seem odd now in terms of compassion. We can look at our loss towards animals now. And in another 50 years, they may be thought of as barbaric. For example, animal rights. So this text that we're looking here on the screen about all creatures is really modern for the 16th century. And it might also be an inspiration for a social action project that your groups might want to think about doing with animals or the environment. And we can start talking about Sar Baalei Chaim, the suffering of living creatures. So it's a principle that is in the Talmud, and it specifically bans inflicting pain on animals. And there's some areas in our lives that affects that we might want to talk about also. For example, vegetarianism, the treatment of animals that we use for food, those of us who use animals for food, free range, the animals that we use for milk, for eggs. And that's a big topic now. And kashrut and eco-kashrut, which is not only being kosher, but making sure that the animals that are slaughtered in a kosher way have also been treated with respect while they've been alive. So, and even caring for a pet, your students probably have pets and they could look at it that way. It would be interesting to talk about this and see where they stand on these different items and where they see compassion as being part of this whole way of treating creatures. And then there's the story about Rabbi Judah the Prince, the compiler of the Mishnah, in which his own physical suffering, and this is going to bring up another thing, but his own physical suffering is either increased or decreased by God in response to his compassion to animals. And we have that story in our second supplement page. So, and because of the way it plays out, it's also interesting to see how your students are going to interpret the story of illness and healing, not only its connection to the practice of Sar Baalei Chaim, but the connection to God responding very directly to what he does. So I'm going to read the story and then we could talk about that, unless there's a comment that you want to put in before that. Okay. Oh, wait, I see something here from Harley. Distributive justice, just like caring for the widow, orphan, and stranger, seems required by Torah, even beyond equal opportunity. And how do you not destroy plants and use inanimate objects and still survive? So I worked for JNF for a lot of years, and I worked with middle school and high school kids, and that was one of our topics. So, for example, if you cut down a tree to build a bookshelf, are you bad? And that's a very interesting question. So what I would tend to say is, if you look at the overall effect on the world of what you do, you're okay making a bookshelf out of a tree as long as you're not destroying the forest. Where I live in the summertime, there's actually an arts center, the Garnerville Arts Center, and there was a guy who built furniture out of only trees that fell. So again, like any midah, there's a continuum. So that's another really interesting conversation to bring up with the students. Are you destroying plants? Actually, plants want to be eaten. They're kind of there for us to eat. Animals, on the other hand, that's something that is also on the continuum. Some people would never eat an animal. Some people wouldn't eat an egg. People do what they feel is right, and we shouldn't tell our students that one or the other isn't good, but we should think about how the animals are treated, I think. So now I'm going to do this Sar Baalei Chaim about how Rabbi Judah the Prince learns empathy for animals. Okay, so this story is in different versions in a few sources: the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, Yalkut Shimoni. So here's the story. One day, a calf being led to slaughter managed to break free and tried to hide under Judah the Prince's robes. While the calf was crying in terror, Rabbi Judah pushed the animal away, saying, "Go, for this purpose you were created." In response to this, heaven inflicted upon the rabbi kidney stones and other painful gastric problems, saying, "Since he showed no pity, let us bring suffering upon him." Years later, the rabbi's maid planned to exterminate some baby rats. Rabbi Judah prevented his maid from hurting them on the basis that it is written, "His mercy is upon all his works." For this, heaven took him from his gastric problem, saying, "Since he has shown compassion, let us be compassionate with him." So there's an implied belief here in the story that assumes that our own capacity for compassion is related to our physical well-being. And it would be interesting to see, do your students understand this idea? Some might literally believe that God intervenes with reward and punishment in this way, but others might not. How else might they understand the story of Rabbi Judah's illness and healing and its connection to his practice of Tzar Balei Chaim? Does anybody want to jump in? Well, I'll start with my own reaction, because I've obviously seen both ideas. I think that in matters like this, it's a matter of spiritual interpretation, and seeing God's actions is sort of within a person. The same thing could happen to two people, and one could see it as an act of God, and one could just see it as random. And I think that people are going to believe what they're going to believe, but it's a topic to bring up, and there's no right or wrong, but it's something to talk about and think about. Does anybody want to say how they feel about it? Oh, wait, we have to unmute you, Bonnie. Hold on. Here, hold on. Unmute. Okay. You're not unmuting. I'm trying to unmute you, but you're not unmuting. Do you want to type it since I can't? I'm unmuting. Oh, there you are. Wait, no. As soon as I unmute you, you're muting again.
I am?
Oh, now you're good. Okay, what did you want to say?
All right. So I think I might talk about how our own bodies and our own feelings could guilt could invoke a tummy ache. And that's somewhere the kids could relate.
Yes, and in fact, stress will cause all kinds of things to people. That's just known. This is even a medical fact. And it's also always interesting to me where science and spirituality overlap. There's a lot that we just don't know yet. It's possible in 100 years we'll be able to measure exactly what it is about stress that causes us to have a tummy ache or other things or other illnesses. And that's a really, really good point and a really good way to handle it. So thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, now animals are being used a lot, for therapy and to help heal people. Yeah. And it just seems that every time I'm around an animal, I just get good feelings. There's things that change in our body chemistry.
That's true.
And they've even done studies and such with people who are older, and I don't know all the science, but there is something that a lot of things we don't know about animals. And so when we accept an animal into our life, it may do something for us more than spiritually, actually biochemically, physiologically. So that's another way of perhaps looking at it as well.
It's true, and that's even being recognized more these days because, people animals are allowed on planes for people who need them, and insurance will pay for animals in certain ways, and animals are trained to be therapy animals. So that's a really good point. And that's another example of how things have changed.
Right.
What's gone on.
Well, that would be a good point of connection, for the kids.
Exactly.
They understand that.
Yeah, and when we're talking about compassion, animals can have compassion for people. There are lots of examples of that.
There's a lot of really incredible videos too now I've seen.
Right.
You
YouTube
know,
is full of them, and you could spend hours
yeah.
because it's great. But animals don't know about justice. They don't have law.
But they do feel compassion.
Exactly.
Right. So
Yeah.
if you go back to the compassion part, they show extreme compassion not only to other animals, but of course to human beings.
Right, exactly. And not always to their own species either. You always see stories. So it's interesting too. So maybe we can derive from this that compassion is more a spiritual thing, whereas justice is more a whatever the opposite of spiritual is, more of a measurable thing.
Mm-hmm. It's also justice, I think, is also brought hierarchy down, where compassion is inner. It's not it's not an external force telling us what's right and what's wrong. It's more how we feel of what's right and what's wrong. And that's probably brought more from our upbringing and our values and our Torah and our midot and our Mussar and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that's a really good point to have in our heads when we're talking to the kids. So that's going to help us.
Nina, I think Ruth just pointed out something really important, that if you compare the Talmudic Jewish approach to judging life, we start with the individual and kind of work our way out. And when you start, as opposed to the Greek Western way of looking at things that starts with the abstract and tries to draw itself in. If you start with the abstract, as Ruth just said, which is justice, you tend to discount the individual situation. So you discount being empathic for the particulars of their setting. Whereas if you start with the individual, you're always being empathic, you're always caring and being compassionate. The downside is that your rules and regulations are going to be really muddy and fuzzy. You just can't be, you got to give up the clarity to have that. But Ruth is exactly right. I think that's a really big distinction between, if you have to Jews versus the Western world, is exactly what you just raised.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Good point.
I know that you're about to get to the part about the language, but one thing that I had thought about related to what Ruth said, I think, is that the English word compassion means suffering with, and rachamim is from womb. And I was trying to think about how those things were different, because I think that empathy has to do with suffering with. If you understand how someone feels and that they're suffering, you have compassion because you understand their suffering. Whereas the idea of something to do with mothering or parenting feels a little bit different to me. It's more of a protective caring for, even if the person's not necessarily suffering. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
I think that compassion doesn't have to be reserved for someone's suffering. I think compassion might be something that you have even when someone's not suffering. Like you could share someone's joy, like, wow, this person just won an award and I'm so happy for them, or they just got married or got a new house or had a baby or whatever, something wonderful happens. And I'm wondering if compassion only extends to when something bad happens, or if compassion can be because I know as a parent, rachamim, I don't think of rachamim as being that way, but it does come from the word for womb, and I think that's possible that, when our children suffer, we suffer, and maybe feeling that way about another person who's suffering is compassion. But I wonder if there's also empathy or seeing the bright side of something and feeling really excited for someone the way we would for our children if something great happened.
Maybe there's a question of the difference between empathy and compassion. But I think what I was trying to get at was that part of the reason for doing these classes is to understand what's uniquely Jewish about these concepts. So if you use the English word compassion, that's not uniquely Jewish. But if you're using rachamim, to explore, is that different in some way? from the English word compassion.
That's interesting. So comparing rachamim and compassion, like just the translation.
Yeah, and do they have a different sense? And is there something unique about the concept of rachamim?
That's a really good thing to point out. There are a few words like that I find. So like the word kavanah. You ever try to translate that to someone who doesn't know what it means? It's really hard. So I think this may be a similar thing. And that's another really good point, because we are talking about what is Jewish about these midot. Although I also think that it's important to know that these midot can be applied to people who are not Jewish. It's just that we've studied them and we think about them as Jewish.
And they're a core value in our identity as Jews.
Right, and we're learning texts that help us think about them. So we're seeing them, obviously, they are Jewish. But it's interesting because I'm sure that we can apply these to people who are not Jewish as well. Anyway, so I'm going to go to the next one because it's very Jewish. It's Sim Shalom. And this can be found in the Amida. Sim Shalom Tova V'racha Chen V'chesed V'rachamim Alenu V'al Kol Yisrael Amecha. Grant to us and to all Israel and to all the world peace, goodness and blessing, grace and kindness and compassion. So we look at this, and there are a few nice related words in here, and they're all different midot. Tova, goodness; bracha, blessing; chen, grace; chesed, loving kindness; and rachamim, compassion. So we can discuss the similarities and the differences between the different terms. Like we weren't having enough trouble discussing justice and compassion, we can now compare these. Especially, I think, so I was thinking about how to do this, and I was thinking that you look at your actions. If you're in a situation, what would you do to show goodness? What would you show to show blessing, grace, kindness? Like you would act slightly differently, and that might help to see the difference between these different midot. Especially the difference between chesed and rachamim is interesting. So it'll be interesting to see what we come up with. I mean, it certainly is good to have compassion, but you can be good without having compassion too. I mean, sometimes there's tough love, and that's a good thing. And you could even argue that maybe tough love has compassion, but you're certainly acting a different way than you would if you were just empathizing and trying to make somebody feel good inside.
Well, tough love is actually showing compassion probably in one of the hardest ways possible. Because
Yes.
You can't break down and hug and kiss, and you have to say, no, I'm not. And therefore, it's even harder for you to be compassionate because it's against what you would do, your instincts.
Exactly. So and I don't know if teenagers are able to understand this or not. It'll be interesting to see where your conversations go. I don't know what teenagers think about tough love. I think they might appreciate it when they get to be young adults. I'm not sure if they appreciate it as teenagers. It would be interesting to see. But that is something that also comes up here. And as we were saying, God's compassion is described as the mercy of a parent towards a child. Rechem means womb, and it's obviously from Rachamim. God is called Harachaman and Rachamana, the merciful one. In rabbinic tradition, we refer to God as Av HaRachamim, the Father of compassion. So it's interesting to see the different names of God and discuss with the students if they've ever experienced God's compassion, if they feel they've experienced God's compassion. I think that sometimes we just need to recognize it. Sometimes it's not obvious.
Well, I think also the teenagers or the kids now, with all the flooding and all the natural disasters, and now with the terrorism in New York and everything, I think a lot of them are questioning the rachamim of God. Why are these things happening to good people? And if he is Av HaRachaman, then where is his role, and what is his role? And I think that's a very important thing here and now.
Yeah, and it's a very hard question to answer. Very, very hard question to answer.
Actually, I'm not so sure about that. I wonder, Ruth, if you discuss with your students the response that's happening, whether it's in New York, in Northern California, in Houston, any place that's had one of these disasters or attacks, the amount of compassion that is coming out of people in response to these actions is really pretty astounding. And that's, Harold Kushner's answer to bad things is a combination of compassion and outrage, or indignation at the injustice and compassion for the suffering. And the level of both of those has been very strong. And if that's God's presence, that's where the Av is coming in to our world. Maybe they've heard lots and lots of stories about people, not doing the initial action, whether it was done by a human being or whether it was a so-called natural disaster, which is an act of God, which is a whole nother discussion. But the question of what are you seeing in the response to these things? And you're seeing both. You're seeing compassion and you're seeing indignation, rage. Although the second one, unfortunately, is going to get you on all the controversial subjects. Whether it's terrorism or it's gun control. Those are both examples of people's outrage about it. But the outpouring of support for the victims, what people are doing for Puerto Rico right now, for other places like that, is really great examples of God's presence.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's certainly in natural disasters is one thing. The Hasidim always say that a disaster is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to be able to express your love and help. So you shouldn't look at it as a bad thing. I live very close to what happened with terrorism. I'm there all the time, and it's literally all the time. So it's very hard for me to imagine. I want to wrap my head around it, that it's an opportunity to show compassion. People do go through stuff, and I think that we have to look at it that way. We have to make something positive out of it. But it is, and that's, I think, why we study this and why we teach this to our students, so that we can make positives out of these things. I think it's really, really important to do that. So that's a very good point. So another thing about this Sim Shalom, I have a link later on to a group singing it. And it's really awesome because it goes into like this rap with all different countries. It's in Hebrew, but the students will be able to hear the word Rachamim, and they'll be able to hear these different countries. And we can talk about peace and the connection between peace and Rachamim. So I'm going to go to the next to the next thing, which is practices, because I'm excited to get to this other part. So some things we can do, some nice practices. So I have Rachamayim. Rabbi Israel Salanter founded the Mussar movement on the belief that repetitive motions like prayers, chants, or good deeds will leave a trace on the soul and lead to changed behavior. So the students can create a prayer or a chant with an accompanying action that reminds you to be kind to those who are different from you. And they practice it every day and see if it makes a change in them. My middle daughter was a cheerleader in high school, and I had her and her friends make up for me because I was teaching a teshuvah secret handshake. So the movements talked about teshuvah, like think about it, say you're sorry, shaking the hand, and then turning while holding on to the other person, not repeating the same mistake again. And sometimes when you have to think of something as a physical movement, it really helps you break it down into the really important parts of it. And I think that your students will have fun doing this. The next practice, schmoozing with grandma. So the word Rachmanis is Yiddish for the Hebrew word Rachmanut, which is another form, obviously, of the word Rachamim. You have the students talk to their parents or grandparents if they've ever heard the expression, have some Rachmanis, and ask how they practice this Jewish value, and then share it when they come back, their interview. And they could do it as a video, they could write about it, they could blog about it. But it would be interesting just to talk to people of another generation and how they would have some Rachmanis. For example, my parents who are really, really old, when my mother was 2, which was like in 1932 or 31, she spilled a whole thing of chicken soup on herself from the stove. She was terribly burnt in the hospital for 9 months. And in those days, hospitals made you pay every day. There was no health insurance. There was no, if you don't have money, you can stay here anyway. there was none of that compassion. And so my grandfather had to pay the hospital every day. And if he didn't pay them, they would have thrown her out. But people would donate. It's just during the Depression too, but people came every day. They gathered it together. They managed to, to keep it going. So that's something that my mother would probably tell if one of my kids asked, what was Rahmanas. So there might be some really interesting stories that they come up with that might be good to share. So that's a suggestion. Okay, and then this one is fun. This great video of Sim Shalom, which you can click on later and see. They use the word Rachamim a few times, and then they have these countries all over the world, and it's interesting to look at them and think about how they relate to compassion. And the students can write their own tune for it, or their own song or poem or rap about Rachamim. They can perform. Students who are, who like to do that. And again, if you video it and put it on Facebook, it would be really fun and cool. This video is interesting too, because it starts with like slightly smaller, slightly nerdy kids singing, and then it goes to something like pretty cool. So it'd be interesting to see the reactions of your students to remind them, if they act a little weird at the beginning, that, we have to have open minds and accept everybody. The place that my daughter teaches, the principal he's a man, but he wears colored nail polish. And it's very interesting to see how these students in Park Slope have to learn, because they, you have to accept people for how they are. And it's just like it's a wonderful example of how these days we are teaching people to be more accepting and more open. And I just think it's really important. So this is a good video. It's fun. And then some social action links. So repetitive social action has been thought to lead to deeper compassion. For example, regular visits to an animal shelter or regular visits to a soup kitchen. And the links on the screen are good suggestions for social action. You probably have some going on in your community anyway, or your students might come up with something because we're talking about animals and we're talking about the environment and compassion and how we fit into the world around us. HIAS is very interesting because, it was originally started to help with Jewish immigrants, and now they rescue refugees from all over the world. So if you look at its missions and values statement at their website, you can see how its work connects with the passages we talked about in the beginning of the of the webinar, of Exodus and Deuteronomy. And how we were strangers and we were helping ourselves as strangers, and now we're helping new strangers. And the next thing is interesting. Karen Armstrong is a scholar whose work is on the interconnectedness of world religions, and she won a TED Prize in 2008. She won $100,000, and she started a movement on the interfaith value of compassion. So we're talking about compassion through a Jewish lens, and now we're talking about compassion as an interfaith value. And if you go to her website, charterforcompassion.org, you can read and sign the charter. There's like a compassion charter. You can read it, and then you can digitally sign it. And there's also a website, Compassion It, which tells more about it. But go to charterforcompassion.org, and you can take a look, and your students can read it, and they can take part in it. Then there's more information. You can investigate the work of Make-A-Wish, because they turned compassion for kids with cancer into action for kids with cancer by helping make their dreams come true. Compassion It is a nonprofit organization and social movement that inspires compassionate actions. So if you go to compassionit.com, you can find ideas to help build compassion. And then for information on how mindfulness and meditation might help cultivate compassion, you can read this article, The Kindness Cure. And there's a link to that. It's really interesting because they actually measured people who meditated this way and people who didn't. And it's so interesting the way they measured it, like in a waiting room. You have to read it. It's really interesting stuff. And it shows how mindfulness meditation actually can help you become more compassionate. I'll just give you a real brief little thing. They have them in a waiting room, and some of them have been meditating and some have not. And an actor comes in. Actually, everyone in the room is an actor except the one person they're measuring, limping and needing a seat. But because no one gets up, there's like a whole, like if you don't see anybody else getting up, most people won't get up either. It's just like a peer pressure thing. But the people that had meditated got up 3 times more often than those who didn't. So it's pretty interesting. So that's like just an interesting thing you might want to read about. And now I'm ready for any questions or anything you want to bring up. We've had some great discussions. So.
I had a question. So I think there's a lot of really great things to discuss in this this month's Vida. But what I really liked about the first two was that there were also other activities. Like there was discussion, but there was, you know, sorting the midot in the order of importance. And then last week there was, you know, deciding which one was generous and with money and so forth. So I was just wondering if anybody had any thoughts about another activity to do with this that is not discussion.
Okay, so I guess a debate is kind of discussion-ish. Making up a rap or a movement and then performing it for the class is one of these activities, you know, about compassion. And I think doing some kind of social action is certainly something that is an activity. These stories that we have included here can also be made into, you can do stuff with them. You can perform them, you can write your own stories, and you can share them. So that's also an activity you can do with this. I'm trying to think what else did we talk about? I think that it would be interesting. I mean, you can expand on anything. You can have people bring pets to school if you want to. You can do whatever it inspires you to do. What activities did you find like the most, like that worked best for your class in the previous sessions?
I found that both sorting the things in order of importance and also, I wasn't thinking that the one last month with the where you put whether it was money, wisdom, or
right, yeah,
actions. I wasn't thinking that was going. They seemed sort of obvious to me, and then we had the most amazing discussion. Like people had really different opinions about it, and it was very, very rich conversation about how those things could be interpreted in different ways. So I thought both of those worked really well for me.
That's really nice. So their suggestion here to take your Midah cards that we have from the first session and look at what other midot, like, and we even started to say, when you look at the first two texts, what are we studying? And look at your Midah cards and put aside all the ones you think might apply until they realize that they're learning about compassion. That's a suggested activity, and sounds like your group would probably inspire a good conversation also. And one of the things I found that I really like is, like, once your group gets going, they know that they're going to have these good discussions, and they'll come back the next time and they'll have great discussions again because they kind of expect it and they're free and they know they can express themselves. And I think that's really important. So it's really good that you had that going on as well. Any other comments or questions or anything before we go?
Well, I just wanted to excuse myself for getting up. I was showing compassion. My 90-year-old Ima lives with us, and she was getting hungry. So I hope you all forgive. I've been listening while I made her sandwich.
That's really nice. Most compassionate of you.
Thank you.
And tell her that we all send our love.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining. And I'm looking forward to hearing how it goes with everybody. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think this is perfect timing also around Thanksgiving. I don't know if we talked about that. I missed the very first few minutes, but I think if we talk about Thanksgiving in the secular world and what we're talking about, and Lahodot LaHashem, that's also compassion.
That's very well said. Thank you. And also there's soup kitchens helping people who don't have a Thanksgiving meal, and all of that applies here too.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Nina.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.